Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, friends. We are so pleased you have joined us for today's program presented by IAALA, the International Association of Armenian Libraries and Archivists, under the umbrella of the Society for Armenian Studies. IAALA was created to provide a worldwide platform for archivists and librarians working with Armenian collections to network with each other, share information and ideas, and solve challenges, promote issues important to our field, encourage participation, and provide mentorship, and to uncover, surface, and map hidden collections, both physical and digital. Please go to our website, yala.org, to find out more about us and to view past programs. Also considering joining this all-volunteer effort. Today we have a special program with Khachik Muradian in conversation with Levon Avdoyan. Khachik is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University and the Armenian and Georgian area specialist at the Library of Congress. So please take it away, Khachik-jan, now.
Thank you, dear Narses, for the introduction. It is my great pleasure to be the interviewer here today and to have this conversation with Levon, with Dr. Levon Avdoyan, my predecessor of several decades at the Library of Congress, and someone that I've had over the years the pleasure of having as my colleague and of having him as my friend. Over the past few years now, I can't believe it's going to soon be 4 years in January at the Library of Congress. Levon has also been a wonderful mentor to me. I particularly remember the first couple of years where, maybe a couple times a week, if not more often, I used to call him because I didn't know where a particular manuscript was, or asking him different questions about the collections, about this and that. And over the years, even though those questions have become fewer, I hope, Levon, but I still rely on his counsel and wisdom and his friendship. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me to be here with all of you and have this conversation with Levon. And there's two things. One is that I'd like us to talk about many of the topics that relate to libraries and librarianship and the importance of the collections. And that is what we will be doing in the next half hour or so. But in addition to that, I also, just to satisfy in part my own curiosity, will ask Levon a little bit more about his interest, his trajectory, and I'm sure many of you here would be interested to hear about that. So that's sort of the general framework. And then afterwards, we will certainly leave time for you to weigh in, to ask questions, to offer reflections, and so on. So without further ado, let's start. So first and foremost, Levon, maybe we can start with your with your journey leading to the Library of Congress. Tell us a little bit about your family, your upbringing, your connection to scholarship, your connection to things Armenian. Tell us, take us on this journey that ended up with you landing at the Library of Congress.
How many hours do we have, Khachik John?
Do that in 60 seconds, please.
60 seconds. It was a long route. Well, I'm second generation Armenian American. My maternal grandparents came from Kharpet, the villages of Hisening and Keserik. My paternal family came from Bitlis. I was born in Providence, Rhode Island, but my father had the bad taste to move us down to Florida when I was 5. So I went from a thriving Armenian community to a sleepy southern town of 100,000 with maybe 100 families, Armenian families. And my sister and I have both rapidly forgot how to speak Armenian. But we were steeped in Armenian tradition and history by our families. I went to college at a small southern university called the University of the South at Sewanee, Tennessee, which is quite well known in the South. Sleepy again, college of 800 male students back then on top of 100,000 acres, 10,000 acres on top of a mountain. And between my junior and senior year, I found myself working for some relatives in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and I told them I'd like to learn Armenian. And they said, well, there is this woman at Columbia University who seems to be teaching at Columbia. Why don't you call her? And I did. And this woman, of course, turned out to be Nina Garsoyan, who, as we know, is not just a woman. She is a force of nature. And I met her at Kent Hall, where she held court for many years. And she asked me what I was doing, and I said, I want to be a historian, and I intend to apply to the University of Virginia to study ancient history under Glanville Downey. And she turned to me and she said, why don't you come study with us? And if there's one thing I'm good at is to jump at suggestions that sound good to me. And I applied and received a 5-year faculty fellowship to study ancient history with a minor in Armenian history and culture, which, just as a sideline, happened right at the time of the student riots, the anti-Vietnam movement. So you can well believe what's going on now in the universities, and at Columbia University are bringing back memories of some 55 years ago now. I won't go into training at Columbia other than to say, unlike most graduate students, I found myself taking 6 and 7 courses a semester under both Morton Smith and Nina Garsoyan and many other wonderful professors. And in 1972, I found myself spending a year in Yerevan, which was one of the most important years of my life, with an IREX fellowship. And the next year, I was the Gennadius Byzantine Fellow at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. Came back and passed my orals, and then received a junior fellowship to study at Dumbarton Oaks Center for Byzantine Studies in Washington. And you can well imagine by that time I was tired. At the end of that year, I said the job market was flat. My dissertation, which should have been something easily done, turned out to be a boondoggle. I won't go into that yet, just other than to say, when we thought I would find 5 manuscripts of my historian in Yerevan, I found 55. And I had visited the Library of Congress. I had always loved libraries. And I said, I'm going to stay down here and see whether I can find a job. And I blanketed the institution with applications to any job that was available. And I was called to come in for a low-level position, an editorial assistant in decimal classification, the Dewey Decimal Center. And Benjamin Custer, who was Mr. Dewey Decimal back then, said, tell me, Mr. Avdoyan, with your qualifications, why do you want this job? And without thinking, I turned to him and I said, I like to eat. And at that, I received the job, and that was the beginning at the Library of Congress. Within 6 months, I had a job in shared cataloging. And in 1978, with the advent of a brand new copyright, a major rewrite of the copyright law, I became an examiner in the literary section of the Copyright Office, where I stayed for 4 years until serendipity struck again. And the main reading room of the Library of Congress needed a classics specialist, and they advertised for that. I got that position. And once again, the marvelous supervisor there, Gary Jensen, one sentence: why don't you go back and finish your doctorate? I wrote to Nina and Martin. They agreed to accept a dissertation the way I had outlined in 1976, and the rest is history until 1992, when, following a gift from Marjorie Dadian to the Library of Congress for the health and maintenance of the Armenian collections, a position of area specialist for Armenia and Georgia was announced. I applied and received that, where I stayed until January 3rd of 2019, retired. And 2 years later, I had the pleasure to see you take on the position, because one of the reasons I retired is I'm a firm believer that there is a time for the older generation to yield to the younger for new blood. And I'm delighted that that happened. So I told my life story in 5 minutes. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that was great. That was great. And one of the things that is I will talk a little more about the Library of Congress, but one thing that stands out, of course, is also your lifelong friendship with Nina, right? Nina Garsoyan was a lot more than an advisor. So maybe you can say a few words about that.
Well, I already knew that I was a feminist because my mother was a concert pianist who won a statewide piano competition in 1937 and received a full ride to a conservatory. And her father, who was a lovely man, wouldn't let her take it because she had to work to put his sons through college. After all, they had to support a family. And I saw the effects of that decision on this very talented woman. And it was very interesting to study under Nina, who was, if anything, talented and brilliant, and to see the misogyny that she had to endure, and yet she thrived. I remember one time I asked her about this. How did she deal with this? And this is the type of woman she was. She said, I just kept working. That was her response, no complaints. But if she liked you, and that means as a student, she would do almost anything for you, whatever it took. She knew I had no family background, for instance. So the year she left for the Soviet Union, she gave me her apartment for that summer. And that was, her one caveat was Rudolf Serkin, the pianist, was supposed to take it, the apartment at 13. She said, now mind you, you keep it clean. And that I did. But she and Morton Smith came from a breed of professors, doctoral advisors, who realized that their role did not stop after you left their classroom. They were engaged in all aspects of your academic life, urging you to apply for grants and positions. And that really stood with me. So that when I decided to leave academics in 1977 after Dumbarton Oaks, I kept up contact with both Morton and Nina, and that's when you can say our friendship began, because I believe in academic distance. I would not call them by their first names until after I was well ensconced at the Library of Congress. And both became very dear friends. And of course, until Morton died in 1991, and Nina, of course, died recently, and 2 years ago. But they are great influences on my life, as are all the professors I had at Columbia. And indeed, I should say, to Tigran and to Nerses, etc. The other influences were in that year I spent in Yerevan. And that year I spent at the Matanadran, which was a totally different animal than you have now. The care that they took for this visiting American Armenian was absolutely astounding. But the librarians and the scholars, it was a wonderful experience.
Wonderful. Maybe we can hear from them a little later about their impressions of that era. One of the things that strikes me most is that, particularly at the Library of Congress, you're typically the new guy for the first, 5 years, 10 years? That's sort of the accepted thing. So I'm the new guy, right? And on top of that, I started working there during the pandemic. And of course, there was another layer of me being new, which is that you really don't know how things were before the pandemic, kind of thing, right? And not to mention that, I'm not even talking about going far back to the, second half of the 70s, because I wasn't around, or I was just busy, getting ready to be born. So give us a little bit of a sort of, and I know, you can take this question, the way you prefer, but it's sort of coming from the sense of the transformations, right? What is, what in this world of the Library of Congress and in general librarianship has changed during your tenure?
Oh, wow.
And how have you, again, just in 60 seconds, and what are your reflections on it?
Let me start by saying I am so happy that I was in the last stage of traditional librarianship, and I saw it. I view 1977 through 1982, before I got what we considered a real library job, although the others were library jobs, and joined the main reading room. I was with the main reading room for 10 years, working alongside some of the most wonderful, brilliant, caring reference librarians you would find anywhere. There is I will be kind. There is a misconception going on recently that the Library of Congress was only for scholars in the past, which is, as I said, a misconception at best, something else at worst. We would help almost anyone coming through those doors who needed the collections. And I spent my first year, because I came there as a specialist. There was no one who could deny that I could help people with ancient history, Byzantine classics, language. But the general reference was a problem. I listened, and I saw, and I realized that rather than teach one class, I was helping and would help hundreds of people, hundreds of doctoral students, hundreds of other people. What has happened can be not exactly blamed on the one word, the internet, but what has happened can be blamed on some people who have perverted this marvelous tool and turned it into the subject itself. I see that this age of information has turned into an age of misinformation. And indeed, one of my fondest memories is the first time I saw a cartoon in the 1990s, which I think still applies. One dog is at a screen, an internet screen, looking down at another dog at his feet, saying, "On the internet, no one knows I'm a dog." I think this has had an impact both on librarianship and on scholarship. And it has changed in fundamental ways the way we handle knowledge. And I think one of the things that bothers me the most is the blurring of the distinction between information and knowledge. Good things are still being done, but it's not my world. We had a program a couple of months ago on AI, and it was brilliant. And this was how modern technology should be used. Mainly, and Emilio is also making great use of this too, using it to get at text, using it to decipher things that the human eye can't do, but not using it to actually complete the creative thoughts that only really a human should do with some bit of humanity and historical background. I don't think that's answered your question, but I think it sets me as a Luddite. I hope it doesn't, but.
And maybe a couple of additional questions sort of within the same general sphere. Let's talk a little bit about Armenian collections.
Yes.
Librarians who deal with Armenian collections, who work with Armenian collections, who serve Armenian collections, and challenges there, right? As you said, there are these major transformations and they're having an impact. inevitably on every aspect, and librarianship is certainly one that is in the process of being, massively impacted by it. What are your thoughts and reflections on that?
My first thought is how much it aided me when I took over the Armenian collection as the first area specialist. I met Nerses, John, I met you in 1995 or 96?
You mean first meeting?
In the United States.
94.
Yeah, 94, 95.
Mm-hmm.
Without the, I always said that the area studies position in Armenia has grown with the Republic because it was about the time of independence. Without the internet, that tool that attached me to the marvelous librarians in Armenia, the tool that attached me to the Cairo office, which collected Armenian materials from the Middle East outside of Armenia, I would not have been half as successful. And here may I do an aside, Khachik, you did not know her. I know Nerses knew her and Nora knew her. I just received word via Nora that the marvelous Armenian librarian at the Cairo office, Araksi Hacherian Dironian, passed away. She a long battle with cancer. Her funeral in Cairo was yesterday. So I want to pay tribute to her because along the way there have been so many people who have contributed to the success of the Armenian collections at the Library of Congress, and she is one of them. In 1999, after a long battle, we succeeded in getting Dr. Paul Krigo at the library as the Armenian and Georgian cataloger. Increments along the way through tools such as the Vartanants lecture series and internet, and finally exhibits, 3 exhibits really. Knowledge of the collections has grown a bit. There are still people who don't know that the Library of Congress now has a significant collection of Armenian materials. But what I tried to drum in all along is when you put that collection alongside the huge collection of maps in the Geography and Map Division, the collection of American manuscripts in the Manuscript Division, the prints and photographs in the Prints and Photographs Division, you do indeed have a major center for the study of Armenian history and culture. And what bothers me is that people simply do not come any longer, or hardly come any longer. And part of the problem there is due to 9/11, due to severe security, and due to the mistaken feeling on the part of scholars that the internet is sufficient. Now, one thing I have omitted about the internet, and I'm so happy to see Tigran here, I can't tell you the number of times that, starting many years ago, Tigran, I can't remember the first time that I discovered that the only place that had a book that one of my readers, my researchers needed was at the National Library. And I wrote to Tigran, and I would say there was no time that it took more than 2 or 3 days for you to get a digitized copy in page turner technology to that researcher. So please don't think I am downplaying the importance of internet. What I am stressing is the misuse of that tool. But it's been really important for the growth of the Armenian collections.
Since you talked a little bit about the collections at the library, do you want to again give us a survey of the way in which those collections have grown over the years, from the early years, immediate aftermath of the war, all the way to
There are a lot of people who deserve praise for this. Up until the middle part of the 20th century, we might have had 200 Armenian language books, and they were mostly either through gifts or through somehow getting into the collection. In 1948, Mr. Arthur Dadian, who was a State Department employee from the region of Harput, along with some notable Armenians, such as Serapi Dernessessian, the great Armenian art historian, and Ruben Gavur, who was also at the State Department, and I immediately recalled a distant relative of my own, so there's kind of a full circle there. I formed the committee for the Armenian collections of the Library of Congress, which was recognized by Luther Evans, the Librarian of Congress at that time. And their sole purpose was to increase the collections of the Library of Congress. And through donations, they started this process. The last record I saw of them was about 1952. So it was not long-lived, but it had an impact. In 1959, Mr. Abraham Bodurgil, as he was known at the library, Bodurian in the community, an Armenian from Istanbul, I believe he worked at the embassy in Istanbul, took on the Turkish collections. He became the specialist for Turkey, and since he knew Armenian, he became responsible for Armenian, but there was really not an intellectual or academic collection at that point. He retired around 1983. We might have had 6,000 or 7,000 items at that time. He was replaced by Dr. Christopher Murphy, who did not know Armenian, and so they knew I was in the main reading room doing classics and ancient history, and they allowed me to recommend to them to recommend the Armenian collections. And so it grew a little until 1992 when I was appointed. At that point, there were pretty good estimate of about 7,000, 7,500 items. And by items, I mean microfilms, books, periodicals, etc. Between that time and the time I left, we had increased to about, I would estimate, 47 to 48,000 items through the accession process. And I think I should mention now that you have already increased that number. So yielding to young blood has proved very good for the Armenian collections at the Library of Congress. And this, one of the reasons I think that it was time for new blood is the fact that I am an ancient historian, a medievalist, and I tried to get as much of the modern period as possible. But I do believe that it's now time to look at it through the eyes of the modernist, since if you look at it the way I have just described, I had control of the collection since 1983. Time for a change.
Yeah, and I do think that the approach of thinking about different disciplines, different schools, and scholarly traditions, etc., is critical, right? In the field of librarianship. One of the ways in which I try to make up for my own shortcomings in the last 3 years, as you know, Levon, we have started these visiting fellowships where Armenian studies scholars every summer are invited to the Library of Congress to conduct research on our collections for several weeks, and then do a presentation, write an article. Whitney Kite, was the first who did that, and then we had Ani Shahinian, and then this summer, in a few weeks, we'll have Chris Sheklian. All three joining us over the past 3 consecutive years. And this has been a wonderful opportunity for us to both study the collections and the manuscripts in our collections and so on, and also encourage greater engagement by scholars, something that, as you mentioned, has been a challenge. And although things are perhaps changed a little bit, maybe in terms of that, but still, there still needs a lot of work to be done on that front. My next question, before maybe to just asking a couple of quicker questions and then opening it up to the audience, is sort of relates to many of us, depending on whether we follow you on social media or not, in what context, etc. We have worked and interacted with you, right? Know certain aspects of your other interests, including, for instance, photography, right? I do know it's clear that this has been something of a passion for you for a very long time. Judging from the photographs you have, perhaps from the 90s in Armenia and elsewhere, and Paris, and right, all the way to now. Do you want to talk a little bit about your essentially the way in which outside of your library, both through scholarship, through what you read, how you spend your time, when you're not being bothered by people like me calling you for advice and suggestions?
First off, I just said that one of the reasons I loved reference librarianship is that you help people, and there's no higher feeling than to do that. So you can call as often as you want. I may tell you that's a stupid question, but it hasn't been so far. How do I spend my time? As you know, long walks in photography, leading me to wonder whether my career should have been in graphic arts as opposed to history and librarianship, but too late for that. I'm soon to be two years shy of 80, so regrets should not be in my makeup. I think about scholarship. I think that my brand of scholarship is dying. It's the traditional way, and it's really not help and honor. I wish I could convince my academic colleagues that they are killing the discipline by not writing more for the public. The more they write for each other, the more they become a enclosed settlement, especially in this era of declining humanities. I think about those things. When I think of writing, I think to myself, cui bono, for who's good, who is actually going to read this kind of scholarship. I also wish that I had a platform to do what I think I do fairly well, and what I think not only for Armenia, but for everyone needs to be done on the part of academics. And that is not only to write about history, but to apply that history. I tried to do that, for instance, in my paper on Karabakh many years ago, in my paper about modern Armenian studies. I do read. I have come to the realization that I absolutely adore reading. I adore thinking about a problem. I come up with solutions, some of them insane, some of them not. I absolutely loathe writing down what I have concluded. I don't mind speaking, I don't mind giving a lecture on it, but the actual physical process of writing, although I'm fairly good at it, bores the hell out of me. Nina and I had a conversation about this. That's the part she actually loved. She'd been trained to write. And that's the big holdup for me. I look down at the paper and I say, oh Christ, I've got to write something. And the ideas are there, it's just not the willingness to put it down. That's how I spend my time.
Yeah, and for someone who, again, doesn't seem to be, as you say, like very much interested in that component, you have been writing, I believe, a couple of articles in recent years that you've been working on. One thing that is very noticeable, and this was one of my first impressions, and it's a constant realization every time Levon visits the Library of Congress, is that, and the Library of Congress is no small shop, right? It has a staff of 1,300 people, largest library in the world. And as you walk around the library with Levon, it's like walking around with a rock star. Everybody loves him. And I have this feeling that, and that is one of the ways in which I sort of, when I started at the library, like I used to tell people jokingly that I am the new Levon, or Levon II. And, and it's this wonderful feeling that over the decades, Levon, and this is something, again, that I tell everyone that I talk to about your tenure, clearly over the decades, not only have you made a tremendous impact on growing this collection, on making it visible, making it accessible to the public through exhibits, to scholars, to graduate students, exhibits, to members of Congress, right? We forget about the other aspect, diplomacy, politics, and the way in which the Library of Congress is at the very heart of the nation's capital. And in many ways, that collection also has significant value in that context. So this is but at the same time, doing all of this, you have also cultivated and created the kind of friendships and connections that clearly have lasted for very long. And not only have you helped you achieve your goals at the library and the library in terms of expanding the collections and making them more accessible, but I hope that they also make my life easier, because I am I can pull your name out of the hat whenever I want, and it's everybody is so it's again, I may have said this to you before, it's been a wonderful experience, essentially being coming into the Library of Congress after your tremendous work and the path, the trail that your trailblazing work. And thank you for that. And I'm sure that all of us here, many of us here, share that sentiment and that feeling of gratitude. Thank you, Levon. And having said that, I would like to open it up. I don't know if Nerses or Nora or Ani, anyone would like to moderate, or would you like me to moderate the Q&A session? But this is an opportunity for those of you who would like to ask questions, make comments, say something, please go ahead. Gavin, I believe you had a question.
Yes, I had a question. Hi, Levon. I was curious because I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and so when I heard you, my alarm bells went off, and I was just curious of what experiences you remember there of the Armenian community, and where maybe exactly you lived, and if you still had family there, and I don't know, a sort of a portrait maybe you could paint for us of a kind of diasporan center in the States, which is relatively unknown compared to the mecca of Los Angeles and Boston and things like that.
Yeah, it is unknown. I wish we had stayed there, Garin. I was born to a fairly large group of Armenians. The last name was Georgian. It was my mother's family. And we lived on Corinth Street, right off of Broad Street, a couple of blocks from Roger Williams Park. And I remember just walking to Roger Williams Park and looking at the Seal House and just loving everything about Providence. My memories are extremely warm, especially since my grandfather and his three brothers each had built cottages down in Narragansett Pier. So every summer was spent down in Narragansett. And summers were also peppered with picnics at Husinec Groves, obviously, since my family was from Husinec. I am not in close touch with anyone except my first cousin, and which is a shame because there's a great network of Georgians there. If it weren't for the damn snow, I'd consider moving back there in my last years, but I'll stay put here. Where were you from?
I was born in Toronto, but as a young kid, I moved to Providence, and I lived more on the northern side of Providence, near actually Douglas and Admiral Street, which was kind of the center at one point of where a lot of Armenians lived, kind of near Providence College and things like that.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It was quite an Armenian center. A lot got done with that early community.
Yeah, and there's been some revival efforts. There's now a Armenian Historical Association of Rhode Island, and they've been putting on exhibitions and have a small
I've been
little
seeing
museum.
that. Yeah. Very good. Good.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first is from Nora. She says, Levon, what is your advice to the new young Armenian librarians?
I have no advice for them. They are so engaged and so energetic, and they know far more than I do about the upcoming technology. The only thing, yes, I do have advice. I really think if you are getting involved in Armenian collections, it is indispensable for you to have more than just mythological background on Armenian history and culture. I think you really need to be trained, if not in the language obviously is important, but there is so much pseudo history out there. There is so much amateur history out there to actually have control of some of the primary sources and secondary sources, so that you don't have to rely on the internet to answer your questions, that you actually have a basic fundamental background. I don't think you can really call yourself an Armenian librarian unless you also know the rudiments of Armenian history and culture. That would be I think, the most important suggestion, Nora, that I would make for all young Armenian librarians.
Thank you, Levon. So we have a question from Lola. Hello, Levon. I would love to return and do more research on Armenian poetry. What has changed since the pandemic? Do we still need a reading card? Do we need to request books ahead of time? Are the questions.
Well, since I have just had to request ahead of time, yes, you do. But I think actually, are you talking, Lolo, John, are you talking about Armenian books or non-Armenian poetry? Hello? Anyway, you do need a reading card. And Khachik, how much in advance would you need to get Armenian books for members of the public now?
Well, if the books are available on site, it's almost immediate. But as you know, a lot of the books are off-site, and for those, it would require a day. So typically, the request would be placed the day before, and the books would arrive or the request would be placed in the morning, and the books would arrive in the afternoon. But yes, for books that are off-site, I would say at least half a day, sometimes even an entire day.
I think you've muted everyone, and Lola can't say.
They can unmute themselves. They can unmute themselves.
There's a question from Daniel, and then if Lola would like to add to her question. Daniel says, could you tell us about worldwide LOC offices? I had no idea there was a Cairo office. What are these offices and what are their responsibilities?
Oh, these are extremely important offices, and I hope they will be with us from now to the end of time. They were set up to acquire foreign materials in areas of the world where it was difficult to really rely on book dealers one by one. Obviously, for the Armenian collections, the Cairo office is the most important. And as I said, that is for acquisitions of materials outside of the Republic. It was set up, obviously, during Soviet times, so there was no direct contact between Cairo and the Republic. There's an office in Rio for South America. There's an office in New Delhi for Asia and parts of the Middle East. Also in Jakarta for Indonesia and for parts of Asia. I don't think I have forgotten any. Iran has been handled by, oh my God, there is another one, and I've forgotten where the city is. There is one that does deal with Iran, but not directly because of American law.
Islamabad.
Islamabad, thank you. Yes, thank you so much. The memory is brilliant, but it's short. So between those, they are responsible for a large portion of the acquisitions into the Library of Congress's custodial collections, and they have been indispensable for the growth of the Armenian collections from the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. In places like Cairo, like Nairobi, right? These offices have been
Nairobi.
a godsend. Nairobi is another important office. And often, these offices play a critical role. Like, the Cairo office has an Armenian staff member, librarian, who has been there for years now. And again, they play a critical role in sometimes cataloging, sometimes acquisitions, etc. The fact that you have someone there who reads Armenian and is able to catalog Armenian books is critical and very helpful to the work of the library. Other questions? I know Garin has another one, but I'd like to see if there are others who have not spoken yet who would like to ask questions or comment. Yes, Laurie.
Yeah, I had a question. Levon, thank you so much for all the work that you've done. And I also appreciated your emphasis on public instruction. So writing not just for other scholars, but for the public. And I think that's so important. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of the work that you've done, engaging with the community, what is some advice that you have for engaging not just younger librarians, but younger people, younger Armenians? What have you found to be effective? Because, I remembered coming to the realization as a young person that, hey, Armenians had a manuscript culture. Like we are holding our cultures also in the libraries. And that was very transformative for me. So I was wondering what your thoughts were maybe on engaging younger generations.
For many years, I hosted, and Khachik has continued this, young Armenians coming through in spring break, the library. And I soon found out that the best way to engage them was to be totally honest with them. Not everything is great, not everything is bright. To show them that Armenian history is not this simple run that they've learned from their priests or their family, but it is a complicated, beautiful, rich record of an ancient people, flaws and all. And when they hear, for instance, I used to give a lecture on the Christianization of Armenia, which I'm sure if the Catholicos ever heard it, he would excommunicate me. Of course, how can you excommunicate an atheist? But that's another matter. But when you hear the complexity of something that is portrayed simplistically, then most people will respond, even if they don't want to believe you, will respond to the fact that this is really interesting. The challenge is to write it or to say it in an inviting, non-didactic form. And I don't quite know how to do that in this day and age of sound bites and podcasts with people who are much more bombastic than I can ever hope to be and persuade hoi polloi with utter falsehoods. But I think the best way to do it is to just show how complex and rich the history is and not apologize for any of it. Does that help at all? I don't know.
Very much.
Thank you. Other questions? Would you like to quickly ask your question, Garin?
Yeah, I was just curious, Levon, about, as a classicist, you came up in this period of time and also the generations preceding you where scholars and even just regular people, non-scholars were expected to learn, ancient Greek or Latin and things like that. But that sort of education has totally, it's very limited now, maybe to like very elite institution. So I'm just curious what sort of effect engaging with those languages had on you, growing up as a scholar, and then how it oriented your sort of trajectory, perhaps as a librarian.
Interesting. It's hard to put that into perspective. Obviously, studying languages was extremely important for me. I'm not very good at speaking the languages I've learned, but I'm fairly good at reading them. Ike can certainly contribute this because along with the languages I know, he knows several others. I mean, I cannot follow his lectures because I don't speak Czech or understand it, but languages are losing their importance in the study of history when, for instance, Princeton University can actually have a serious discussion about dropping the need for knowledge of Greek to get a classics degree, then you know something is wrong with modern education. I have a habit of reading interesting things and not cutting out the newspaper article when I read it. But many years ago, there was an article in a Virginia paper, I believe, saying that in an inner city school, they decided to try to teach the children from homes that you may imagine Greek. Not only did these children thrive with Greek, and because they were finally challenged to learn something, all of their other scores and their test scores rose. The problem is we have been too easy on the learning process in the United States for the past few decades. I think forcing students to learn at least one language for their high school degree is not an unreasonable expectation. But there are other things as well that can be done. For me, it totally engaged me, and especially when I started using the languages in my research, the utility of these languages finally convinced me that I was doing the right thing. Anijan, are you raising your hand?
Levon Can, Pratik Can. Thank you for very engaging and interesting talk, and I enjoyed, and I took my opportunity to posting a comment on my personal Facebook page that I'm really very sorry that only 3 people from Armenia are following your live talk, 2 Armenian area specialists of LOC talking to each other. So I know that not only questions, but some people prepared remarks or rethink messages addressed to you, I believe. If there are people who wish to talk, that this is your opportunity. Anijan, do you have something to tell?
Hi, Levon and Patrick, thank you so much for this engaging conversation. And Levon, we also wanted to use this IAALA and Focus as an opportunity to share some love on our end for you.
And it's returned.
And invite anyone who wants to share some thoughts about working with you or your friendship. And I just wanted to start and say how much I've valued your friendship over the years, and you're one of those really rare academics who also profoundly believes in the power of libraries and the importance of libraries, and it is something that is rare. And how fun it has been, I'll say on my end that just dreaming up IAALA and putting it together and seeing it now flourish and grow has been very, very rewarding. But I'd also like to mention, Levon, how much I valued, and I think I can speak for some here today, how much we valued your mentorship, because I think that's very underrated overall in Armenian circles particularly because it requires so much generosity and so much of somebody putting aside their self to share with others. And I think you've been a wonderful, wonderful mentor, and that's something that I can't, you know, that really needs to be highlighted. And I just wanted to thank you, and we're not letting you go because you can't ever retire.
Oh, but it's in such good hands. Remember what I said, that there's a time for the older generation to yield to the young, especially if they're capable, and you all are just capable. I must say that planning IAALA, first with Ani and Nora and Seta, got me through the pandemic. You know, those were the years that we were actually discussing it. And you know, I was alone in the apartment and isolating. So I need to thank all of you and the new executive committee once we formed it. This is an extremely important initiative which needs to thrive on its own, and it is now. And I think all of us should be happy about that. But thank you for your kind words. It's returned.
Thank you, Levon, and I'd like to add some words from me. Like I have known you for over 30 years now, because we first met in April 1994 at the Library of Congress, and you was my first tour guide to introduce the treasures of the great library. I fell in love immediately. Since then, we have become true friends and met regularly in the States and Armenia. You're an amazing friend, historian, and a well-known Armenology specialist. During my almost 20 years of service at the U.S. Embassy Public Affairs section, we worked closely to establish a exchange program between the Library of Congress and the Armenian academic libraries, including the National Library, the National Academy of Sciences, Fundamental Library, Yerevan State, Montenegro, and other institutions. Colleagues, Dr. Avdoyan traveled to Armenia as a library speaker, and I had the pleasure to escort him to several Yerevan and regional libraries with his talks about different topics. And I will always remember our visits to Khorvirab, Norab, Hagartsin, Sevan Monastery, and I know there is much more we will visit together someday. I wish, Levon, you health, joy, and happiness, and hope to see you soon for our museum tours together in Washington. And you know, today is a museum night in Yerevan, and every year I visit at least 3 or 4 museums. But I stayed for this important meeting. I enjoyed it completely. Thank you, Patrick Jan, for leading this conversation with Levon. And thank you, friends. If you have more questions or remarks.
Yes, I believe Emilio would like to say something, and then Nora, go ahead, Emilio.
Yes, thank you. I also would like to join the others in thanking Levon for, it has been used the word mentorship. More than a mentor, I would say Levon has been an ally for me for many, many years. I think we met first in 2006, possibly in Geneva. And speaking of internet and technologies, I think it was the first time for me. I had just started graduate studies, and this was a conference of the IAALA organized by Valentina Calzolari, and Michael Stone couldn't be present. And it was the first time, to the amazement of many, that his paper would be recorded and then presented at the conference. But that was not the first time we really talked and engaged with each other. That happened in another place very dear to Levon, which is Paris. And not only is the combination of Paris, but it was the 90th birthday of Nina Garsoyan. So there was a lot of people in a very good-looking building in Paris, and we had a kilometers long walk from through the Champs-Élysées till I think it was the Rue des Écoles. We had in the Quartier
Yes.
Latin, we had some dinner there. And so that's when the friendship really started. And from there, Levon always helped, even at a distance, whenever I had questions. I got one of his books delivered here to Berlin per post, just because I asked a question about something. He said, oh, you may find something here. And that was very kind. Another point that probably wasn't touched was your connection to music. Even in that case, I remember once I was writing a booklet for a CD. My partner is a conductor, and it was Levon who at the time, the pleasure actually to correct and to go through the English and enjoying also the music through it. And finally, I would like to thank you once again publicly in this platform, because last November, I in the occasion of a colloquium in Lamberton-Oaks, which are organized on Armeno-Byzantine relations, Levon, and actually Hachik was also there, Levon came to pay tribute at the end of the workshop to Nina Garsoyan. Unfortunately, the event was closed, but I thanked you back then, but I would like to do it now again, Coram Populo. Thank you so much, Levon, for everything that you have done. And I hope that this will continue from many, many more years to come. Thank you, Levon.
Thank you, Emilio. I
I
didn't
see
know
that Tigran and Nora also want to talk. Tigran, you go next.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Levon. Thank you, Hachik, for this interesting conversation or talk. And I would like to send my gratitude to Levon for his contribution to librarianship as a member of the Library of Congress team, and his assistance to the Armenian library community with many questions. Just two small examples. In 2022, the Library of Congress corrects Armenian massacre subject heading to Armenian genocide, thanks also to Levon's efforts. And another example, when we started our project on building Armenian libraries computerized network, that was beginning of 1990s. I asked Levon to assign abbreviations to participant libraries, Armenian participant libraries. And this task was done, and until now, the abbreviations are in use. So Levon, a great job, great assistance, and thank you, my friend, for your immeasurable contributions. And may your future endeavors be as rewarding and fulfilling as your time with us in IAALA. So thank you, keep care, good health. And as Nerses mentioned, today is the museum night. Now I am planning to move to the cognac factory museum, and a glass of a cognac for
have
you.
one for me.
Yes, for you.
Let me correct
So good
one
health,
thing.
my good friend.
Thank you, Tigran. I have to correct something. Although I worked on the genocide subject heading for decades with, it came about, and there's a tie to IAALA, it came about finally when I was asked to join Nora and Ani and Seda and Lori Kamparyan, if I remember correctly, to a committee to do this, and working together. And then finally to have Nora submit when we finally forced a recognition by LC, this should be, and I won't go into how, that it should be accomplished. Nora submitted the paperwork through UCLA, and that's how the change in the subject heading came about. So in the final analysis, it was a group effort. But I appreciate that. It's been a pleasure working with. One of the things that has to be stressed, working with the Armenian librarians since 1992 has been not a teaching experience, it's been a learning experience. We've all learned from each other, and that it was a high. I remember my first trip to Armenia after becoming the area specialist was 1996. And I returned to the Library of Congress to hear my colleagues complaining about this or complaining about that. And I finally blew up and I said, I have just come back from 2 countries, Armenia and Georgia, where their librarians are going to work with no heat in winter, low salaries, extended hours for the love of their culture, and they are creating librarianship here. I don't want to hear these complaints, and that put a stop to it. I have learned so much from the librarians in Armenia, so the thanks are returned to you royally.
Thank you. I'll be very brief because I know it's getting close to the end, but I was a reference librarian in the main reading room, and Lee had been there a number of years before I arrived, and I was very new and very unsure of myself, and I have no connections with Armenian country or language, but Lee, again, the theme of mentorship is here, and he mentored me in my subject areas of religion, and he felt I should know German, and so he started a German class for me and a few other colleagues. He mentored me in so many ways, and I would have had a very different career without him. And Lee, I'm so grateful to you. You did so much more than just the Armenian world or the classics world. You really affected so many of us in so many great ways. Thank you.
Thank you, my dear. A very good friend of mine. I paid her to say these things.
Thank you. Nora, do you have something to add? Because you raised your hand. Okay. Anybody else?
I think it's time for you to go to a museum there, Seth.
Then thank you everyone, especially Khachik and Levon, for a wonderful evening. I enjoyed it myself, and now it's a museum time. And let's keep in touch and be a part of IAALA family and work together. Keep working together. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you
Bye,
very much.
everyone.
Thank you.